Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, 37 Years. The morning mist clung to Riverside Cemetery like a shroud, matching the gray weight in Marshall McNeil's chest. He stood beside the mahogany casket, his weathered hands folded behind his back, watching as the last mourners filed past Nancy's grave. At 62, Marshall had the build of a man who'd spent decades in construction. Broad shoulders, callous palms, and steel-gray eyes that missed nothing. Today, those eyes were rimmed with red, but they remained sharp. Nancy McNeil had been his anchor for 37 years. They'd met when he was a young foreman building the new wing of St. Mary's Hospital, and she was a nurse working double shifts to pay for her sister's medical school. She'd brought him coffee during his lunch break, claiming the construction crew looked half dead from exhaustion. That coffee break had turned into dinner into weekend drives, and weekend drives into a lifetime together. Marshall remembered their wedding day. Nancy in her grandmother's lace dress, him in his only good suit, both of them grinning like fools in the tiny chapel downtown. They'd honeymooned in a borrowed cabin by Lake Morrison, where Nancy had traced the scar on his forearm from a job site accident and promised she'd patch up all his wounds, literal and otherwise. She'd kept that promise for nearly 4 decades. They'd weathered everything together. The lean years when Marshall's construction company nearly went under, the joy when Santos was born, the heartbreak of 3 miscarriages afterward. Nancy had been the one to suggest they adopt Santos's friend Dustin when the boy's parents died in a car crash. Family isn't just blood, she'd said, and Marshall had agreed wholeheartedly. But somewhere along the way, Santos had forgotten that lesson. Marshall's jaw tightened as he glanced at his son, who stood 30 feet away near the limousine, checking his phone with the casual indifference of someone at a bus stop. Santos McNeil was 34 now, tall and lean like his mother, but with Marshall's dark hair and an expensive suit that cost more than most people made in a month. His wife Tammy clung to his arm, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled despite the humid morning, her designer black dress more appropriate for a cocktail party than a funeral. They'd flown in from Chicago the night before, staying at the Riverside Marriott instead of the family home where Marshall rattled around alone since Nancy's diagnosis. Too depressing. Tammy had whispered loud enough for Marshall to hear when Santos suggested staying at the house. Santos hadn't corrected her. The pastor's final words drifted across the cemetery. Nancy McNeil was a woman of faith, compassion, and unwavering strength. She touched countless lives as a nurse, as a mother, and as a pillar of this community. Though she has left us, her legacy of kindness and love will endure in all who knew her. Marshall closed his eyes, remembering Nancy's last coherent day. The cancer had ravaged her body, but her mind remained sharp until the very end. She'd gripped his hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Marshall, honey, there's something important I need to tell you about the house. Promise me you'll trust Franklin, no matter what happens. Promise me." He'd promised, of course, though he hadn't understood what she meant. Franklin Fitzpatrick had been their lawyer for 15 years, handling everything from Marshall's business contracts to their wills. He was scheduled to read Nancy's will tomorrow morning, a formality, Marshall assumed, since they'd written mirror wills years ago. Everything to each other, and if they both died, everything to Santos. The crowd began to disperse. Marshall accepted condolences with quiet dignity, shaking hands with neighbors, former colleagues, and Nancy's friends from the hospital. His adoptive son Dustin Hilton approached, his EMT uniform wrinkled from a double shift he'd pulled to attend the funeral. "Dad," Dustin said quietly, "I can stay a few more days if you need me." Marshall squeezed Dustin's shoulder. At 29, Dustin had grown into the kind of man Marshall was proud to call son. Responsible, hard-working, devoted to helping others. He'd try to visit Nancy every week during her illness, bringing flowers and sitting for hours reading to her when she was too weak to hold a book. "You've got your own life to live, son. Thanks for being here." Dustin's gaze shifted to Santos, who was now talking loudly on his phone about stock prices, his voice carrying across the cemetery. Santos didn't even speak at the service. People grieve differently, Marshall replied, though the words tasted bitter. Yeah, well, some people don't grieve at all. Before Marshall could respond, Santos strode over, his phone finally tucked away. Up close, Marshall could see the expensive details, the Italian leather shoes, the Swiss watch, the silk tie. Santos had done well for himself in Chicago, working as an investment advisor for high-net-worth clients. He'd married Tammy 3 years ago in a lavish ceremony that cost more than Marshall's first house. They'd invited 200 guests, but somehow forgotten to include Dustin in the wedding party. Dad, Santos said, his tone brisk and businesslike, Tammy and I need to head back tonight. Flight's at 8. I understand, Marshall said, though he didn't. Nancy's sister Ada was driving in from Denver tomorrow for the will reading. Marshall had hoped Santos might stay to see his aunt, maybe help sort through Nancy's things. But Santos had always been in a hurry to be somewhere else. Tammy stepped forward, her smile as artificial as her eyelashes. Marshall, we're so sorry for your loss. Nancy was... She paused, clearly struggling for something genuine to say, a lovely woman. Santos cleared his throat. Actually, Dad, there's something we need to discuss. About the house. Marshall's blood chilled. What about the house? Santos exchanged a glance with his wife before reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a folded document and handed it to Marshall with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. This is an eviction notice, Santos said, his voice steady and cold. You have 30 days to vacate the property. Marshall stared at the paper in his hands, the words blurring together. I don't understand. Mom left the house to me, Santos continued, and now there was something ugly in his smile, a satisfaction that made Marshall's stomach turn. The will was updated 6 months ago. I figure it was better to get this handled quickly rather than drag it out. The cemetery seemed to spin around Marshall. Nancy's grave was still open, the flowers from the service wilting in the afternoon heat, and his son was handing him an eviction notice from his own home. The home where he'd carried Nancy over the threshold 35 years ago. The home where they'd raised Santos, where Nancy had recuperated from her surgeries, where she'd died peacefully in Marshall's arms just 4 days ago. 6 months ago. Marshall's voice cracked. She was barely conscious 6 months ago. Tammy's smile widened. Oh, she was lucid enough to sign the papers. We made sure of that. The callousness in her voice snapped something inside Marshall, but he kept his expression neutral. 37 years in construction had taught him to read people, to spot the weak points in a structure before it collapsed. And he was beginning to see the cracks in his son's story. I see, Marshall said quietly, folding the eviction notice and putting it in his pocket. Well, I suppose Franklin will sort this all out tomorrow during the reading. Santos's smirk faltered slightly. There won't be much to sort out. The house is mine now. Marshall nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving his son's face. We'll see. As Santos and Tammy walked away, Marshall felt a hand on his shoulder. Dustin was standing behind him, his face flushed with anger. Did I just hear what I think I heard? You did. That son of a... Dustin caught himself, glancing at Nancy's grave. How can he do this to you? Marshall watched Santos help his wife into the limousine, saw them laugh about something as the driver closed the door. 34 years of memories flashed through his mind. Teaching Santos to ride a bike, attending his baseball games, working double shifts to pay for his college education, walking him down the aisle at his wedding. I don't know, Marshall said finally, but I intend to find out. Chapter 2. The Foundation. That evening, Marshall sat in Nancy's rocking chair on the front porch of their Victorian home on Elm Street, a bourbon in his hand and 37 years of memories swirling in his mind. The house had been Nancy's pride and joy, a 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors, stained glass windows, and a wraparound porch where they'd spent countless evenings watching the sunset. Marshall had bought the house as a surprise for their 5th wedding anniversary, using every penny of his savings and taking on debt that kept him awake at night. Nancy had cried when she saw it, not just from joy but from worry about the mortgage. Can we really afford this? She'd whispered. Marshall had pulled her close and promised they'd make it work together. And they had. He'd spent weekend for the next 3 decades improving the place, refinishing floors, updating the kitchen, adding the master bathroom Nancy had always wanted. Every board he'd nailed down, every wall he'd painted, every fixture he'd installed had been an act of love. This wasn't just a house. It was their life together, made tangible. His phone buzzed with a text from Dustin. "Can't stop thinking about today. This isn't right." Marshall typed back, "I know, son, but we'll handle it the right way. The right way might not be enough. Santos has changed. He's not the brother I grew up with." Marshall set down his phone and sipped his bourbon, remembering the Santos of 20 years ago. He'd been a good kid, maybe a little spoiled, but decent enough. He'd played varsity basketball, dated the homecoming queen, and graduated near the top of his class. Marshall and Nancy had been proud when he got into Northwestern on a partial scholarship. But something had shifted during his college years. Santos came home less frequently, and when he did visit, he seemed embarrassed by his parents' modest lifestyle. He'd made comments about the dated furniture, the small-town mentality, the limited opportunities in Riverside. After graduation, he'd moved to Chicago and quickly climbed the ladder at a prestigious investment firm. The real change had come when he met Tammy. Tammy Lindsay was the daughter of a Chicago real estate mogul, raised in Lake Forest with trust funds and country club memberships. She was beautiful, ambitious, and utterly convinced that anyone who lived in a town with fewer than 1 million people was beneath her notice. Marshall had disliked her instantly, not because of her wealth, but because of the way she looked at him and Nancy, like they were curiosities in a museum. Nancy, ever the optimist, had tried to give Tammy the benefit of the doubt. "She's just young," Nancy would say after particularly awkward visits. "She'll come around once she settles into the family." But Tammy never settled. If anything, she seemed to actively drive a wedge between Santos and his parents. The wedding had been the final straw. Santos had asked Marshall to walk him down the aisle, not because he wanted his father there, but because Tammy's father was already giving her away, and someone had to fill the role. They'd seated Marshall and Nancy at table 12, behind Tammy's college roommates and distant cousins they'd never met. When Marshall offered a toast about family and love, Tammy had literally rolled her eyes. After that, Santos's visits became even less frequent. Phone calls dwindled to perfunctory holiday check-ins. When Nancy was diagnosed with ovarian cancer 18 months ago, Santos had sent flowers and a card that read, "Thinking of you during this difficult time." He hadn't visited until the diagnosis became terminal. Marshall's jaw clenched as he remembered Nancy's face during Santos's last visit 2 months ago. She'd been so excited, cooking his favorite meal despite being barely able to stand. Santos had spent most of the dinner talking about his new Tesla and complaining about property taxes in Illinois. When Nancy showed him photo albums from his childhood, he'd glanced at them politely before launching into a story about his latest investment success. The worst part had been when Nancy asked if he might consider moving back to Riverside someday, maybe starting a family nearby, so she could be a grandmother. Santos had laughed, and said, "Mom, no offense, but this place is dying. Why would I want to trap my kids here?" Nancy had excused herself to the bathroom, and Marshall had found her crying quietly by the kitchen sink. "He's embarrassed of us," she'd whispered. "My own son is embarrassed of the life we built." Now, sitting on the porch of that life, Marshall wondered how he'd missed the signs. How had the boy he'd taught to throw a baseball become a man who could hand him an eviction notice at his mother's funeral? His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. Franklin Fitzpatrick's name appeared on the screen. "Franklin," Marshall answered. "Thanks for calling." "Marshall, I heard what happened to the cemetery today." Franklin's voice was tight with anger. "I want you to know that whatever Santos told you about Nancy's will, it's not accurate." Marshall felt a spark of hope. "What do you mean?" "I can't discuss the details over the phone, attorney-client privilege, and all that. But I need you to trust me, just like Nancy asked. Can you come to my office an hour before the official reading tomorrow? There are things we need to discuss privately." "Of course." "And Marshall, don't let Santos or his wife pressure you into signing anything, no matter what they say or what documents they produce." After hanging up, Marshall felt a grim smile tug at his lips. Nancy's last words echoed in his mind. Trust Franklin no matter what happens. He pulled out the eviction notice and read it again more carefully. Something about the legal language seemed off, too aggressive, too rushed. Real estate law wasn't his area, but 37 years in construction had taught him about contracts and property rights. This document felt like a bluff, a psychological weapon designed to intimidate him into compliance. Marshall thought about his son's smirk, about Tammy's cold satisfaction, about the way they'd stood together at the cemetery like vultures circling a fresh kill. They'd expected him to crumble, to accept their version of events without question. They'd underestimated him. Marshall had built his construction company from nothing, weathering recessions, corrupt city officials, and competitors who tried to undercut him with shoddy work and illegal labor practices. He'd learned to spot a con job from a mile away, and he'd never back down from a fight when he was in the right. He finished his bourbon and headed inside, stopping in Nancy's study, where she'd kept all their important papers. Her reading glasses were still on the desk, next to a half-finished crossword puzzle she'd never complete. Marshall touched them gently before opening the file cabinet. The marriage certificate was there, along with birth certificates, insurance policies, and mortgage documents. He pulled out his copy of their last will and testament, dated 8 years ago. According to this document, everything went to the surviving spouse, and upon both their deaths, the estate would be split between Santos and Dustin, with specific provisions for Nancy's sister Ada. Marshall studied the signatures, the notarization, the witness statements. Everything looked legitimate. So if Santos had a newer will, where had it come from? And why hadn't Nancy mentioned changing their estate plan? As he was putting the papers back, Marshall found a manila envelope tucked behind the hanging folders. His name was written on the front in Nancy's careful handwriting, along with the words "Private," for Marshall only. Inside was a single sheet of paper with Nancy's handwriting, dated 3 weeks before her death. "My dearest Marshall, if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and I wasn't able to tell you everything face to face. I know Santos and Tammy have been planning something. I overheard them talking during their last visit, thinking I was asleep. They believe I'm going to leave everything to Santos in my will. I want you to know that I would never do such a thing without discussing it with you first. Our home is your home, earned by your sweat and sacrifice and love. Santos has chosen his path, and it doesn't include us. I've made arrangements with Franklin to ensure you're protected, no matter what Santos tries to do. Trust Franklin, trust yourself, and remember that sometimes the people who claim to love us reveal their true nature only when they think we're too weak to fight back. You are not weak, Marshall McNeil. You are the strongest, most honorable man I've ever known. Don't let them take what you've built. Fight for it. All my love, always, Nancy." Marshall read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. Nancy had known. She'd seen through Santos and Tammy's act and prepared for their betrayal. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his wallet, right next to a picture of Nancy from their wedding day. Tomorrow, he would learn what plans his wife had made. And then Santos would discover that his father was far from the broken old man he'd expected to find. Marshall McNeil had built his life from the ground up once before. If necessary, he'd do it again. But first, he'd make sure his son understood the true cost of betrayal. Chapter 3. Reading Between the Lines. The law offices of Fitzpatrick and Associates occupied the second floor of the historic Riverside building downtown, with windows overlooking Main Street and the river beyond. Marshall arrived 30 minutes early, needing time to compose himself after a sleepless night spent reading Nancy's letter over and over. He'd known his wife was perceptive, but her ability to see through Santos and Tammy's manipulation still amazed him. Franklin Fitzpatrick was waiting in his office, a tall, silver-haired man in his late 50s who'd practiced law in Riverside for over 30 years. He'd handled everything from Marshall's business incorporation to Nancy's medical directives, and Marshall had always trusted his judgment. Today, Franklin looked unusually grim as he gestured for Marshall to take a seat. "Before the others arrive," Franklin began, "I need to show you something." He opened a thick folder on his desk. 3 months ago, Nancy came to me with concerns about Santos. She said she'd overheard him and his wife discussing your house, making plans based on assumptions about her will. Marshall pulled Nancy's letter from his wallet and slid it across the desk. Franklin read it carefully, his expression darkening. "This confirms what she told me," Franklin said. Nancy was worried that Santos would try to manipulate the situation after her death. She was particularly concerned about forged documents. Forged documents? Franklin leaned back in his chair. "Santos called my office 6 weeks ago, claiming Nancy wanted to update her will. He said she was too sick to come in person and asked if I made house calls. When I said I'd be happy to visit, he quickly changed the subject and said he'd get back to me. He never did. But the eviction notice is worthless," Franklin interrupted. "It was prepared by some cut-rate lawyer in Chicago, based on a fictional will that doesn't exist. At least, not legally." Marshall felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by anger. "So this whole thing is fraud?" "Attempted fraud, yes. Nancy suspected Santos might try something like this, so she took precautions." Franklin opened another folder and pulled out a document bound in blue legal backing. "This is Nancy's real last will and testament, updated 2 months before her death and properly witnessed by myself and 2 of my partners." Marshall stared at the document. "What does it say?" Franklin's smile was grim. "That's what we'll find out when everyone gets here." Nancy insisted that will be read aloud to all interested parties, including Santos and his wife. She wanted to make sure there were no misunderstandings. A knock on the door interrupted them. Franklin's secretary, Mrs. Goodwin, poked her head in. "Mr. Fitzpatrick? The other parties have arrived." Marshall's stomach tightened as Santos and Tammy walked into the conference room adjoining Franklin's office. Santos wore another expensive suit, his confidence evident in every step. Tammy clutched a designer purse and looked around the modest law office with barely concealed disdain. "Morning, Dad," Santos said with artificial warmth. "I hope you've had time to process everything from yesterday." Before Marshall could respond, Dustin arrived, still in his EMT uniform from another overnight shift. He'd driven straight from the station, his eyes red-rimmed but alert. Behind him came Nancy's sister Ada Goodwin, a retired teacher who'd driven through the night from Denver. Ada was 5 years younger than Nancy, but looked older, worn down by a difficult divorce and financial struggles that Nancy had quietly helped her through for years. "Ada," Marshall said, standing to embrace his sister-in-law. "I'm glad you made it safely." Ada hugged him tightly. "I wouldn't miss this. Nancy called me 2 months ago and specifically asked me to be here today. She said it was important." Santos and Tammy exchanged glances, their confidence wavering slightly. They'd expected only Marshall and Dustin to attend the reading. Franklin took his place at the head of the conference table, the will in front of him. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here for the reading of the last will and testament of Nancy Ruth McNeil, deceased. Before I begin, I want to clarify that this document was properly executed according to Missouri state law, with appropriate witnesses and notarization." He looked directly at Santos. "This is the only valid will executed by Mrs. McNeil. Any other documents claiming to represent her final wishes are either outdated or fraudulent." Santos's face reddened. "Now wait just a minute. Let him read it," Tammy hissed, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Franklin cleared his throat and began, "I, Nancy Ruth McNeil, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils." He went through the standard legal language before reaching the meat of the document. "To my beloved husband, Marshall McNeil, I leave our home at 1247 Elm Street, Riverside, Missouri, along with all furnishings, personal effects, and real property associated therewith. This house represents 35 years of our shared dreams and should remain his sanctuary for as long as he chooses to live there." Marshall felt tears prick his eyes. Even in death, Nancy was protecting him. Franklin continued, "To my dear adopted son, Dustin Hilton, who has shown unwavering love and devotion to this family, I leave the sum of $50,000 to be used toward the purchase of his first home or for any other purpose he deems fit." Dustin's eyes widened in shock. He'd never expected anything from Nancy's estate, considering himself lucky just to be part of the family. To my sister Ada Goodwin, I leave my jewelry collection and personal savings account, currently valued at approximately $35,000, in gratitude for a lifetime of sisterly love and support. Ada began crying quietly. The money would solve her financial problems and allow her to retire with dignity. Santos had gone pale, but Franklin wasn't finished. Regarding my biological son, Santos McNeil, Franklin read, his voice taking on a sharper tone, I wish to address his inheritance specifically. Over the past several years, Santos has made it clear through his words and actions that he considers his childhood home and family an embarrassment to his current lifestyle. He has repeatedly expressed his desire to escape Riverside and has shown minimal interest in maintaining relationships with his extended family. Santos half rose from his chair. This is ridiculous. Sit down and listen. Ada snapped with surprising authority. Your mother has something to say. Franklin resumed reading. Furthermore, during my final illness, I became aware that Santos and his wife Tammy were making plans regarding my estate without consulting either myself or my husband. I overheard conversations in which they discussed selling our family home and using the proceeds for their own purposes, apparently believing I was too incapacitated to understand their intentions. Tammy's face had gone white. This is lies. We never. Are you calling my dead sister a liar? Ada's voice could have cut glass. Franklin held up his hand for silence and continued. In light of these circumstances, I leave to Santos McNeil the sum of $1 to be paid from my estate, along with this message. True wealth is not measured in money or property, but in love, loyalty, and character. You have chosen to pursue material success at the expense of family bonds. I pray that someday you will understand what you have lost and find your way back to the values your father and I tried to teach you. The silence in the room was deafening. Santos stared at Franklin as if he'd been slapped, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something that might have been shame. That's impossible, Santos whispered. She wouldn't. I'm her son. Yes, Franklin said quietly. And she loved you enough to leave you something more valuable than money, a chance to examine your choices and perhaps change course. Tammy jumped to her feet, her composure finally cracking. This is bullshit. We're going to contest this will. My father has lawyers who will tear this thing apart. You're certainly welcome to try, Franklin replied calmly. However, I should warn you that Mrs. McNeil anticipated such a challenge. She left detailed documentation of your conversations, including audio recordings made from her bedroom during your last visit when you believed she was sleeping. Marshall looked at Franklin in amazement. Nancy had always been thorough, but this level of preparation was extraordinary. Franklin pulled out a small digital recorder and pressed play. Santos and Tammy's voices filled the room, discussing the house's potential market value and their plans to convince Nancy to leave everything to Santos. The old man won't fight us, Tammy's recorded voice said clearly. He's too broken up about Nancy to think straight. We just need to get the papers signed before he figures out what's happening. And if he does fight, Santos's voice asked, then we'll contest his competency. A grieving widower, probably drinking too much, not taking care of himself. It won't be hard to make a case. The recording ended, leaving another crushing silence. Santos buried his face in his hands. Mom was recording us. She was protecting herself and her husband, Ada said coldly. Something you should have been doing instead of plotting against them. Tammy grabbed Santos's arm. We're leaving. This is all going to be overturned. But Santos didn't move. He looked across the table at Marshall with something approaching recognition, as if seeing his father clearly for the first time in years. Dad, he said quietly, we never meant. Marshall stood slowly, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the room held its collective breath, waiting to see if decades of family bonds might somehow bridge this chasm. Then Marshall spoke, his voice steady and final. Santos, your mother gave you exactly what you deserved. I suggest you think long and hard about why. He walked out of the conference room without looking back, leaving his son to contemplate the true cost of his choices. Chapter 4. Foundations Crumble. 3 days after the will reading, Marshall sat in his kitchen eating breakfast when his phone rang. Franklin Fitzpatrick's name appeared on the screen. "Marshall, I thought you should know. Santos and Tammy hired a lawyer in Chicago to contest the will. A firm called Whitman, Pierce and Associates." Marshall set down his coffee cup. "How strong is their case?" "Practically non-existent. Nancy's will is airtight. The recordings are admissible, and witnesses can testify to her mental competency right up until her death. But they're going to make noise, and it could tie up the estate for months." "Let them," Marshall said quietly. Nancy prepared for this. "We'll fight it." After hanging up, Marshall walked onto his front porch and surveyed Elm Street. It was a quiet residential neighborhood of older homes, well-maintained by owners who took pride in their properties. He'd lived here longer than anyone on the block, watching families move in and grow up, children graduate and move away, couples grow old together. Mrs. Patterson next door was watering her flower garden, and she waved when she saw him. "Morning, Marshall. How are you holding up?" "Taking it one day at a time, Helen." Nancy would want me to keep the place looking nice. She certainly would. That woman had the most beautiful roses in Riverside. Helen's expression softened. "I heard Santos was in town for the funeral. Such a shame he doesn't visit more often." Marshall nodded noncommittally. Helen didn't need to know about the family drama, but he suspected the whole neighborhood would hear about it soon enough. Small towns had a way of making private matters public. That afternoon, Dustin stopped by after his shift. He found Marshall in the garage, organizing Nancy's gardening tools. She'd been passionate about her flower beds, spending hours each weekend tending to roses, peonies, and the vegetable garden out back. "Dad, you don't have to do this alone," Dustin said, taking a pair of pruning shears from Marshall's hands. "I can help with Mom's things." "I need to stay busy," Marshall replied. "Sitting around thinking isn't good for me right now." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, boxing up tools and supplies. Dustin had inherited Nancy's green thumb and had already volunteered to maintain her flower beds. "I keep thinking about the will reading," Dustin said eventually. "The look on Santos's face when Franklin played that recording. What about it?" For just a second, he looked like the brother I remembered from high school, like he realized what he'd done. Dustin shook his head. Then Tammy dragged him out of there, and the moment passed. Marshall paused in his sorting. "Santos made his choices, son. He's been making them for years." "I know. It's just, we used to be close, you know? Before college, before Tammy. He taught me to drive, helped me with homework, stood up for me when kids at school gave me grief about being adopted." Dustin's voice carried old pain. "I keep wondering when that person disappeared." Marshall thought about Santos at 17, teaching a 12-year-old Dustin to throw a curveball in the backyard. Or Santos at 22, fresh out of college and full of big dreams about changing the world. What had ambition curdled into greed? When had love of family become embarrassment about his humble origins? "People change," Marshall said finally. "Sometimes not for the better." That evening, Marshall was reading in Nancy's chair when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Santos's number, his first communication since the will reading. "Dad? It's Santos." "I know. What do you want?" There was a long pause. When Santos spoke again, his voice was strained. "I wanted to apologize. About the eviction notice, about everything. It got out of hand." Marshall waited, saying nothing. "The thing is," Santos continued, "Tammy's father has been pressuring us about investments, about showing we can handle family finances responsibly. When we thought Mom was leaving us the house, it seemed like a solution to some problems we've been having." "What kind of problems?" Another pause. "Market problems. Some of my clients lost money on deals I recommended. Nothing illegal, just bad timing. Tammy's father is considering pulling his investment from my firm unless we can demonstrate better judgment." Marshall began to understand. "So you needed Nancy's house as collateral." "Something like that." "Dad, I know how this sounds, but we're not the villains here. We just got in over our heads, and when it looked like Mom might help us out by dying and leaving your house. That's not what I meant." Santos's voice sharpened. "Look, I called to apologize, but also to make you an offer. Drop your opposition to the will contest, and I'll split the house proceeds with you 50-50. That's fair, right? You get enough to buy a nice condo somewhere, and I get enough to solve my business problems. Marshall felt a familiar coldness settle over him. The same feeling he got when contractors tried to cheat him or city inspectors demanded bribes. Let me make sure I understand this. You want me to help you steal my house so you can bail yourself out of bad business deals? It's not stealing. I'm offering you half of my own property. Dad, be reasonable. You're 62 years old, rattling around in a house that's way too big for one person. Wouldn't it be smarter to downsize? Take the money and enjoy your retirement. Marshall thought about Nancy's roses, about the kitchen where they'd shared thousands of meals, about the bedroom where she died in his arms. No, Santos. It wouldn't. Fine. Then we'll see you in court. The line went dead. Marshall set down the phone and walked to the window, looking out at the street lamps beginning to flicker on in the gathering dusk. He'd expected Santos to call, but he'd hoped for genuine remorse instead of another manipulation attempt. His phone rang again almost immediately. This time was Ada. Marshall, honey, I just got a call from some lawyer in Chicago asking questions about Nancy's mental state before she died. They wanted to know if I thought she was competent to make legal decisions. What did you tell them? The truth. That my sister was sharp as a tack right up until the end, and that she specifically told me to be at that reading because Santos was going to try something underhanded. Ada's voice turned fierce. They also asked if I knew about any family conflicts that might have influenced her decision. And I told them about Christmas dinner 2 years ago, when Tammy made that comment about upgrading to better family once Santos' career took off. Nancy cried herself to sleep that night. Marshall remembered that Christmas. Tammy had drunk too much wine and said things that revealed her true feelings about the McNeil family. Santos had laughed it off as holiday stress, but Nancy had been wounded deeply. Ada, you should know, Santos is going to make this as ugly as possible. They might dig into everything, looking for ammunition. Let them dig. Nancy was my sister for 67 years, and I know exactly who she was and what she wanted. They can ask all the questions they want. After ending the call, Marshall walked through the house, turning on lights in every room. The place felt enormous without Nancy's presence, but it didn't feel empty. Every room held memories. Every piece of furniture had a story. This wasn't just his house. It was their history together, made solid and permanent. Santos could hire all the lawyers he wanted. He could contest the will, challenge Marshall's competency, drag the family through months of legal warfare. But he'd forgotten something important about his father. Marshall McNeil had spent 40 years fighting for what he'd built, and he'd never lost a battle when he was in the right. Tomorrow, Marshall would start fighting back, and Santos was about to learn that some foundations couldn't be shaken, no matter how hard he tried to tear them down. Chapter 5, Counterattack. Marshall spent the next morning in Franklin Fitzpatrick's office, planning their defense strategy. Franklin had brought in Jorge Becker, a litigation specialist from St. Louis with experience in contested wills and family disputes. The key to winning this, Jorge explained, is controlling the narrative. Santos and his wife want to paint Nancy as mentally incompetent and you as a manipulative influence. We need to show the opposite, that Nancy was fully aware of her decisions and made them based on years of observing her son's character. Marshall leaned back in his chair. What do you need from me? Documentation. Photos, letters, emails, anything that shows the deteriorating relationship between Nancy and Santos over the past few years. We also need witnesses who can testify to Nancy's mental state and Santos's behavior. Franklin consulted his notes. I've already contacted Dr. Vernon Howard, Nancy's oncologist. He'll testify that Nancy was mentally sharp throughout her treatment, discussing complex medical decisions right up until her final week. What about character witnesses? Jorge asked. Pastor Samuel Christensen at First Methodist, Marshall said. Nancy talked to him about her concerns regarding Santos. And Sylvia Henry, the head nurse at Riverside General. She worked with Nancy for 20 years and visited regularly during her illness. Jorge made notes. Good. We'll also want to depose Santos and Tammy separately. Get them on record about their financial situation, their conversations with Nancy, their expectations regarding the inheritance. Marshall's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Mr. McNeil, this is Manuel Miller, investigative reporter with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. I understand there's an interesting contest developing in Riverside. Would you be willing to discuss your perspective on this family dispute? Marshall showed the message to the lawyers. Franklin frowned. Word travels fast. Santos must have leaked this to put pressure on you. Or Tammy's father, Jorge suggested. Chicago real estate developers have connections everywhere. He might be trying to embarrass you into settling. Marshall typed back, not interested in talking to reporters. But the damage was already done. By that afternoon, Marshall's phone was ringing constantly with calls from journalists, bloggers, and even a producer from a true crime podcast who wanted to explore inheritance fraud in small-town America. Marshall turned off his phone and drove to the cemetery to visit Nancy's grave. Someone had placed fresh flowers, white roses, Nancy's favorites. A small card was tucked among the stems, from your friends at Riverside General. As Marshall knelt to arrange the flowers, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Chris Lyons, the cemetery groundskeeper, approaching with a troubled expression. Mr. McNeil, I'm sorry to bother you, but I thought you should know. Someone was here earlier asking questions about your wife's burial. Marshall stood slowly. What kind of questions? A woman in a fancy car, blonde hair. She wanted to know about the funeral service, how many people attended, whether your wife seemed, whether she seemed all there in her final days. Chris shifted uncomfortably. I told her she needed to mind her own business. Tammy. Marshall felt his jaw clench. Thanks for letting me know, Chris. Also, Chris hesitated. She asked if I knew anything about you drinking too much lately or acting strangely since the funeral. I told her you've been nothing but respectful and dignified every time I've seen you. So Tammy was building a case for Marshall's incompetency, gathering ammunition from anyone who might have observed him since Nancy's death. It was a smart strategy, if unethical. That evening, Marshall was preparing dinner when Dustin arrived with a pizza and a grim expression. Dad, we need to talk. I heard from 3 different people today that someone's been asking questions about you around town. Marshall got plates from the cabinet. Tammy, most likely. She's trying to paint me as an unfit, grieving widower. It's more than that. Dustin opened the pizza box. She went to Murphy's Tavern and asked the bartender if you'd been drinking heavily. She talked to the pharmacist about whether you'd picked up any prescriptions for depression or anxiety. She even called my supervisor at the EMT station, claiming to be concerned about your mental health. Marshall felt his anger building, but he kept his voice calm. What did people tell her? Nothing useful, thankfully. Jake at Murphy's said you've been exactly once since the funeral, had 1 beer with your dinner, and left a good tip. The pharmacist told her your medical information was confidential. And my supervisor hung up on her when she started asking specific questions. They ate in silence for a few minutes, both lost in thought. Finally, Dustin spoke up. Dad, I have an idea. It might be underhanded, but then again, so is what they're doing. Marshall looked at his adopted son with interest. I'm listening. What if we let Tammy think she's getting somewhere? Feed her some false information and see what she does with it. Such as? Dustin smiled grimly. Well, I might mention to certain people around town that you've been acting a little strange lately. Forgetting things, making odd decisions. Nothing too dramatic, just enough to give Tammy confidence in her strategy. Marshall began to see the potential. And then we document her using that information in ways that prove she's acting in bad faith. Maybe even get her to commit perjury. Marshall studied Dustin's face, seeing Nancy's intelligence shining in his eyes. That's a dangerous game, son. So, is letting Santos and Tammy destroy your reputation and steal your house. That night, Marshall called Franklin and Jorge to discuss Dustin's idea. After an hour of debate, they agreed on a modified version of the plan. We'll need to be very careful, Jorge warned. Any evidence we plan has to be legally obtained, and we can't encourage them to break the law. Just give them enough rope to hang themselves. Franklin nodded. I'll reach out to some of my contacts in town. Let them know Tammy's been asking questions. If she's going to conduct an investigation, we might as well control what she finds. Over the next few days, Marshall played his part perfectly. He made small, seemingly innocent mistakes around town, forgetting his wallet at the grocery store, asking the bank teller to repeat information twice, appearing slightly confused about dates when talking to neighbors. Meanwhile, Dustin spread carefully crafted concerns to people he knew would eventually talk to Tammy. He mentioned that Marshall seemed to be struggling more than he's letting on, that he'd found his father staring blankly at old photos for hours, that Marshall had asked him the same question 3 times during one conversation. The plan worked perfectly. Within a week, Tammy had collected a dossier of evidence suggesting Marshall was suffering from grief-induced dementia or depression. She'd even convinced a few people to sign statements about his declining mental state. What Tammy didn't know was that Jorge Becker had hired a private investigator to document her activities. Every conversation, every leading question, every pressure tactic was recorded and photographed. The trap was set. Now they just had to wait for Santos and his wife to walk into it. Chapter 6, The Squeeze. 2 weeks after implementing their counter-strategy, Marshall received a call from Santos that confirmed their plan was working. "Dad, I've been thinking about our situation," Santos began, his voice carefully modulated with false concern. "Tammy and I have been talking to people around town, and we're worried about you." Marshall put the call on speaker so Dustin could hear from the kitchen. "Worried about what?" "Your mental state. People are saying you've been acting confused, forgetful. Maybe the grief is affecting you more than you realize." "I'm managing fine, Santos." "Are you, though? Because what we're hearing suggests otherwise." Santos's tone became more aggressive. "Look, Dad, here's what I'm thinking. What if we could work out a deal that benefits everyone? You sign over power of attorney to me, I handle the estate issues, and you get to stay in the house for as long as you're competent to live alone." Marshall felt a surge of satisfaction. Santos was taking the bait perfectly. Power of attorney? Just temporary, until you're feeling more like yourself. Tammy's father knows some excellent doctors in Chicago who specialize in grief counseling, cognitive assessment. We could get you the help you need. And what happens to the house? Well, obviously, if you're not mentally competent, the will contest becomes a different matter. But we're family, Dad. We make sure you're taken care of. Marshall exchanged glances with Dustin, who was holding up his phone, recording the conversation. "I need to think about this," Marshall said. "Of course. But Dad, don't take too long. If your mental state continues to deteriorate, we might have to petition the court for guardianship. That would be much more complicated for everyone." The threat was clear: cooperate, or we'll have you declared incompetent. After Santos hung up, Marshall called Jorge Becker. "They're moving faster than we expected." "Good. That means they're feeling pressured. How much evidence do we have of their investigation tactics?" Marshall consulted the folder Jorge's private investigator had compiled. Photos of Tammy questioning 12 different people around town, audio recordings of her leading questions, and statements from several people about her offering them money for negative information about my mental state. Outstanding. And they still don't know we're on to them. As far as I can tell, they think their plan is working perfectly. That afternoon, Marshall met with Dr. Vernon Howard, Nancy's oncologist, at Riverside General Hospital. Dr. Howard was a soft-spoken man in his 60s who'd treated cancer patients for over 30 years. He'd grown fond of Nancy during her long battle with the disease. "Marshall, I heard about the will contest," Dr. Howard said as they sat in his office. "I want you to know that Nancy discussed her concerns about Santos with me on several occasions." "What did she say?" "She was heartbroken about the distance that had grown between them, but she was also clear-eyed about his motivations. About 6 months before she died, she asked me directly if grief could cause someone to make irrational decisions about their estate." Marshall leaned forward with interest. "I told her that grief affects people differently, but that love and disappointment could certainly influence how someone chooses to distribute their assets." She said she was glad to hear that, because she wanted to make sure her final wishes were seen as the product of careful thought, not emotional reaction. Dr. Howard pulled out Nancy's medical file. "I documented our conversation because she specifically asked me to. She was concerned that her mental competency might be challenged after her death." "By Santos." She didn't name him directly, but the implication was clear. She wanted medical documentation that she remained mentally sharp throughout her treatment. Dr. Howard flipped through several pages. Her cognitive tests were consistently normal, even in her final weeks. Physically, she was failing, but mentally, she was as sharp as ever. That evening, Marshall was washing dishes when he heard a car pull into his driveway. Through the kitchen window, he saw Santos and Tammy getting out of a rental car. Santos looked nervous, but Tammy strode toward the front door with predatory confidence. Marshall dried his hands and went to answer the door, making sure to appear slightly confused and disoriented. "Santos, what are you doing here? We flew in this afternoon, Dad. We need to talk." Santos pushed past Marshall into the living room, Tammy close behind. "Marshall," Tammy said with artificial sweetness, "we're so concerned about you. People in town have been telling us you've been struggling." Marshall blinked slowly, as if trying to process her words. "Struggling? I don't understand." Santos and Tammy exchanged meaningful looks. "Dad, when's the last time you balanced your checkbook?" Marshall appeared to think about it. "My checkbook? Your bank account, Dad. When did you last check your balance?" "Nancy always handled that," Marshall said, letting his voice waver slightly. "I don't know how. The numbers get confusing." Tammy practically purred with satisfaction. "Marshall, honey, we brought some papers for you to sign. Just temporary arrangements so Santos can help you with your finances." She pulled out a folder containing power of attorney documents. Marshall recognized the format from his construction business. These papers would give Santos complete control over his assets. "I don't know," Marshall said hesitantly. "Nancy said I should trust Franklin." "Franklin's a small-town lawyer, Dad," Santos interrupted. "These are complex estate issues. You need someone with more experience." Marshall let them pressure him for 20 minutes, playing the confused widower perfectly. Finally, he agreed to think about it overnight, but suggested they leave the papers so he could study them. After they left, Dustin emerged from the back bedroom, where he'd been listening and recording everything. "Did you see Tammy's face when you acted confused about the checkbook?" Dustin grinned. She looked like a shark smelling blood. Marshall's expression was grim despite their success. "I never thought my own son would try to have me declared incompetent to steal my house." "That's not your son in there," Dustin said quietly. "That's whatever Tammy and her family turned him into." Marshall looked at the power of attorney documents scattered on his coffee table. Tomorrow, he would spring the trap. Santos and Tammy were about to learn that underestimating Marshall McNeil was a very expensive mistake. Chapter 7. The Trap Springs. The next morning, Marshall called Santos to arrange a meeting at Franklin's office. "I've decided to sign those papers," he said, affecting the confused tone he'd perfected. "But I want a lawyer to witness it." Nancy always said lawyers were important for signing papers. Santos could barely contain his excitement. "Of course, Dad. We want everything done properly." Marshall suggested they meet at 2 p.m., giving Jorge Becker time to set up recording equipment and ensure everything was documented. Franklin had also arranged for Dr. Vernon Howard to be present, ostensibly for a routine consultation, but actually to conduct an on-the-spot cognitive assessment. At precisely 2 p.m., Santos and Tammy arrived at Fitzpatrick and Associates, accompanied by their Chicago lawyer, Arnold Wise. Wise was a sharp-dressed man in his 40s who specialized in what he euphemistically called elder law, helping families manage assets when older relatives became incapacitated. "Mr. McNeil," Wise said, extending his hand, "I'm here to make sure this transition goes smoothly for everyone involved." Marshall shook his hand with a slightly trembling grip, playing his part. "I just want to do what's best. Nancy always said family should help family." Franklin guided them into the conference room where Dr. Howard was waiting. "Doctor, thank you for coming. Mr. McNeil wanted a medical professional present to confirm he understands what he's signing." Dr. Howard nodded professionally. "Of course. Mr. McNeil, would you mind if I asked you a few questions first? Just standard cognitive assessment." "Questions?" Marshall looked confused. "What kind of questions?" Tammy leaned forward eagerly. "Just simple ones, Marshall. Nothing to worry about." Dr. Howard began with basic orientation questions: date, location, current president. Marshall answered most correctly, but hesitated on a few, appearing uncertain about specific dates. "What year did your wife pass away?" Dr. Howard asked. Marshall frowned as if concentrating. This year, 2024. Can you tell me what month we're in now? October. No, wait. September. Marshall looked around the room, helplessly. The days get mixed up since Nancy died. Santos exchanged triumphant glances with Arnold Wise. This was going even better than they'd hoped. Dr. Howard continued the assessment for 15 minutes, while Marshall gave responses that suggested mild cognitive impairment. Nothing dramatic, but enough to support Santos's case for temporary guardianship. Well, Dr. Howard said finally, Mr. McNeil does show some signs of confusion, which isn't uncommon in elderly individuals dealing with grief and major life changes. Arnold Wise leaned forward. Doctor, in your professional opinion, is Mr. McNeil competent to make complex financial decisions at this time? Dr. Howard appeared to consider carefully. I'd want to do more comprehensive testing, but based on this brief assessment, I'd say he might benefit from family assistance with financial matters, at least temporarily. Santos could barely contain his glee. Dad, you see? We're just trying to help. Marshall nodded slowly and reached for the power of attorney documents. If the doctor thinks it's best. He picked up the pen with a shaking hand and began to sign his name. Santos and Tammy watched intently as he laboriously wrote, Marshall, on the first document. Then Marshall stopped, set down the pen, and looked directly at Santos with crystal-clear eyes. You know what, son? I've changed my mind. The transformation was instantaneous and startling. Marshall's posture straightened. His voice became firm and authoritative, and all traces of confusion vanished from his expression. Santos blinked in confusion. Dad, what's happening? What's happening, Marshall said calmly, is that you just attempted to defraud a mentally competent individual by conspiring to have him declared incompetent based on fabricated evidence. Arnold Wise shot to his feet. Now wait just a minute. Franklin opened the conference room door, and Jorge Becker walked in carrying a thick folder. Behind him came Detective Calvin Hayes from the Riverside Police Department and 2 FBI agents whom Jorge had contacted about potential interstate fraud. Santos McNeil and Tammy McNeil, Detective Hayes said formally, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and attempted theft by deception. The room erupted in chaos. Santos shouted protests while Tammy turned on her husband with vicious accusations. Arnold Wise was demanding to know what evidence existed and threatening lawsuits. Jorge Becker calmly opened his folder and began laying out photographs, audio recordings, and witness statements. We have documented evidence of Mrs. McNeil conducting a systematic campaign to gather false testimony about Mr. McNeil's mental state, including offering bribes for negative statements. He pulled out transcripts of phone calls. We have recordings of both defendants discussing their plans to manipulate the inheritance process and have Mr. McNeil declared incompetent if he refused to cooperate. Franklin added his own bombshell. We also have Mrs. McNeil's attempted bribery of 3 town residents, captured on video by a private investigator. Dr. Howard stood up with quiet dignity. For the record, Mr. McNeil's cognitive assessment was entirely theatrical. I've been monitoring his mental state throughout this process, and he shows no signs of impairment whatsoever. In fact, his ability to maintain this deception demonstrates exceptional mental acuity. Santos stared at his father in disbelief. You've been faking this whole time? Marshall's expression was granite hard. I've been protecting myself from my son's criminal conspiracy, something I never imagined I'd have to do. As the FBI agents began reading Miranda rights, Tammy finally cracked completely. This is all your fault, she screamed at Santos. Your pathetic father and his worthless house. My father is going to destroy you for dragging our family into this. Actually, one of the FBI agents said, consulting his notes, we'll be having a conversation with Mr. Lindsay as well. Conspiracy charges often extend to all participants, regardless of which state they live in. Santos looked around the room desperately, finally focusing on Marshall. Dad, please. We can work this out. I'll drop the will contest. I'll apologize. You'll face the consequences of your choices, Marshall interrupted. Just like Nancy's will said you would. As they were led away in handcuffs, Santos called out one last time, I'm still your son. Marshall watched through the conference room window as his biological son was placed in the back of a police car next to his wife. For just a moment, he felt a stab of grief for the little boy who used to help him in his workshop, the teenager who'd been so proud to work construction jobs during summer breaks. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who'd been willing to destroy his own father for money. Nancy had been right. Sometimes the people who claim to love you reveal their true nature only when they think you're too weak to fight back. Marshall McNeil had never been weak, and now the whole world knew it. Chapter 8. Aftermath. 3 weeks after the arrests, Marshall sat in his kitchen reading the morning paper while sipping coffee from Nancy's favorite mug. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch had run a feature story about the case under the headline, Small Town Justice, how a grieving widower outsmarted his greedy son. The article painted Marshall as a sympathetic figure who'd use intelligence and patience to protect himself from family predators. The story had been picked up nationally, turning Marshall into an unlikely folk hero. His mailbox was full of letters from people sharing their own stories of family betrayal and inheritance disputes. 3 book publishers had called wanting to option his story, and a producer from Netflix had left several voicemails. Marshall ignored them all. He had no interest in profiting from his family's destruction, even if that destruction had been necessary. Dustin knocked on the back door and let himself in, carrying a bag of groceries. "Morning, Dad. Thought I'd make us some breakfast." Since the arrests, Dustin had been stopping by every morning before his EMT shifts, worried that Marshall might be struggling with depression or guilt about Santos's fate. But Marshall felt surprisingly at peace. Nancy's final wishes had been honored, justice had been served, and the house she'd loved would remain his sanctuary. "Any word from Santos?" Dustin asked as he unpacked eggs and bacon. "Franklin says he's been moved to the federal facility in St. Louis pending trial. Tammy made bail and flew back to Chicago." Marshall folded the newspaper. Her father disowned her publicly in the Chicago Tribune yesterday. The Lindsay real estate empire was in full damage control mode, with Tammy's father claiming he'd had no knowledge of his daughter's criminal activities. Private investigators hired by his company had uncovered evidence that Tammy had forged documents and misappropriated funds from other sources, suggesting this wasn't her first fraudulent scheme. Dustin cracked eggs into a pan. "What about the will contest?" Santos's lawyer withdrew it yesterday. Arnold Wise is facing his own legal problems now. Apparently he's done this before with other families. The Illinois State Bar is investigating. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, both men processing the dramatic changes of the past month. Finally, Dustin spoke up. "Dad, I keep thinking about what Santos said as they took him away, about still being your son." Marshall had been thinking about that too. "What about it? Do you think there's any chance he might learn from this? Maybe prison will help him remember who he used to be." Marshall considered the question carefully. Santos was facing federal charges that could result in 5 to 10 years in prison, even with a plea bargain. Tammy would likely receive a lighter sentence in exchange for testifying against her husband, but their marriage was clearly over. Santos would emerge from prison middle-aged, divorced, and professionally ruined. "I don't know," Marshall said finally. Nancy always believed people could change if they wanted it badly enough. But they have to want to change. That afternoon, Marshall was working in Nancy's rose garden when Franklin Fitzpatrick stopped by with paperwork to officially close the will contest. "It's finally over," Franklin said, watching Marshall prune dead blooms. "The house is yours free and clear, all challenges withdrawn." Marshall stood up, brushing dirt off his knees. "Nancy would be pleased. I think she'd be proud of how you handled this. She knew you were strong enough to protect yourself, but I don't think even she anticipated you'd turn the tables so completely." They walked around to the front porch and sat in the wicker chairs Nancy had bought at an estate sale 20 years ago. The afternoon sun was warm, and Marshall could smell the last blooms of summer in his neighbor's flower beds. "Franklin, I want to ask you something. Nancy's will mentioned that $1 inheritance for Santos. Is there any legal way to increase that if he ever deserves more?" Franklin raised his eyebrows. "You're thinking about changing your own will?" "I'm thinking about keeping options open. If Santos serves his time and genuinely changes, if he makes amends, and becomes the man Nancy tried to raise, then maybe he deserves a second chance. That's generous, considering what he put you through. Marshall looked at his hands, still stained with soil from Nancy's garden. Nancy used to say that holding on to anger was like grasping a hot coal. You're the one who gets burned. I don't want to spend whatever years I have left consumed by bitterness toward my son. Franklin nodded thoughtfully. I could draft some language that gives you flexibility. A provision that allows you to modify Santos's inheritance based on his future conduct, evidence of genuine rehabilitation, that sort of thing. But only if he earns it. If he comes out of prison the same selfish person who went in, then Nancy's judgment stands. That evening, Marshall called Ada to give her an update on the legal proceedings. Nancy's sister had returned to Denver, but called every few days to check on him. How are you holding up, honey? Ada asked. I saw the article in the paper. You're famous now. I'm managing fine. The reporters have mostly moved on to other stories. And Santos. Marshall told her about his conversation with Franklin regarding the will. Ada was quiet for a long moment. You know, she said finally, Nancy would have liked that idea. She never gave up hope that Santos might find his way back to the family values you two try to teach him. She was always more forgiving than I was. No, Marshall, she was just as angry and disappointed as you were. But she also remembered the little boy who used to bring her dandelions from a yard and call them flowers. She hoped that boy was still in there somewhere. After hanging up, Marshall walked through the house, turning on lights as darkness fell. The place still felt too quiet without Nancy's presence, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like home, his home, earned through decades of hard work and love, protected by intelligence and determination. Tomorrow he would start planning what to do with the rest of his life. Maybe travel to places Nancy had always wanted to see. Maybe volunteer at the hospital where she'd worked. Maybe just tend her garden and remember the good years they'd shared. But tonight, he would sit in her chair and read one of the books she'd always recommended, but he'd never found time for. He had time now, all the time in the world, in a house that would always be theirs. Chapter 9. New Growth. 1 year later, Marshall stood in his backyard admiring the memorial garden he'd created in Nancy's honor. The space where she'd grown vegetables was now filled with her favorite flowers. White roses, purple irises, and the peonies she'd babied through countless Missouri winters. A small stone bench sat in the center, engraved with the simple words, Nancy Ruth McNeil, she made everything grow. The past 12 months had brought unexpected changes to Marshall's life. Santos had been sentenced to 6 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy charges. Tammy received 2 years and was already serving her time in a minimum security facility in Illinois. Their divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, with Tammy losing all claim to the few assets Santos had remaining. But the biggest surprise had come 6 months into Santos's incarceration, when Marshall received a letter written in his son's handwriting. Dad, I know I have no right to expect you to read this, let alone respond. I know I forfeited the privilege of calling you Dad when I handed you that eviction notice at Mom's funeral. But I need you to know that I remember who I used to be, and I'm ashamed of who I became. Prison gives you a lot of time to think. I've been working with a counselor here, trying to understand how I turned into someone who could hurt the people who love me most. I don't have any excuses. I chose money and status over family. I chose Tammy's approval over Mom's love. I chose selfishness over everything you and Mom tried to teach me. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I remember the man you are, the father you were, and the lessons you tried to teach me. Maybe it's too late for me to become that person again, but I'm going to try. I'm sorry, Dad, for everything. Santos. Marshall had read the letter dozens of times, looking for signs of manipulation or false sentiment. But the handwriting was shaky, the words simple and direct, and the overall tone suggested genuine remorse rather than calculated appeal. He hadn't responded immediately. Instead, he'd sought advice from Franklin, from Ada, and even from Dr. Howard, who'd become a friend over the months since the trial. All of them had counseled patience. Wait and see if Santos's apparent transformation continued, or if it was just another scheme. 3 months later, a second letter arrived. This one was longer, describing Santos's work in the prison library teaching literacy to other inmates, his participation in a program for financial criminals that required him to write letters of apology to his victims. He mentioned reading books Nancy had recommended years ago that he dismissed as boring. He wrote about missing simple things, Sunday dinners, working in the yard, conversations that weren't about money or status. Again, Marshall didn't respond, but he kept the letter. The third letter came with an unexpected attachment, a money order for $3,000 made out to Riverside General Hospital. Dad, this is money I earned from my job in the prison laundry. I know it's not much compared to what I tried to steal from you, but I want to donate it to the hospital where Mom worked. Maybe they can use it for something that would make her proud. I don't expect anything from you. I just need to try making amends, even if it's too late. Santos. Marshall had taken the money order to Sylvia Henry, the head nurse who'd been Nancy's friend. She'd wept when he explained where it came from. Nancy never stopped believing Santos had goodness in him, Sylvia had said. She'd be so happy to know he's trying to find his way back. Now, a year after Nancy's death and Santos's arrest, Marshall was facing a decision he'd never expected to contemplate. Yesterday's mail had brought another letter, this one different from the others. Dad, I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything, but I'm going to ask anyway. Not for money or help with my legal problems. I accept the consequences of my choices. But I'm asking if you might consider visiting me, just once. I have 18 months left on my sentence, and then I'll be released on parole. I don't know where I'll go or what I'll do. I've lost my career, my marriage, most of my friends. But I found something I didn't know I was missing, a sense of who I'm supposed to be. If you're willing, I'd like to apologize to you in person. I'd like to tell you about the man I'm trying to become. And I'd like to ask your advice about how to make the rest of my life count for something. I understand if you can't forgive me. I understand if seeing me would be too painful. But if there's any chance you might consider it, I'm at Federal Correctional Institution Greenville, and visiting hours are Saturdays from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Your son, if I may still call myself that, Santos. Marshall folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket, next to a photograph of Nancy from their wedding day. He'd been carrying both items for 3 days, unable to decide what to do. A knock at the back door interrupted his thoughts. Dustin appeared with a grocery bag and his usual concerned expression. Morning, Dad. You look like you're wrestling with something heavy. Marshall pulled out the letter and handed it to Dustin, who read it carefully. What do you think? Marshall asked. Dustin was quiet for a long time, staring at the memorial garden. I think, he said finally, that Mom would want you to go. Even after everything he did, especially after everything he did. You taught me that being family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to love someone even when they don't deserve it. Santos made terrible choices, but he's still your son. And if there's a chance, he's genuinely trying to change. Marshall thought about Nancy's final words about trusting his own judgment. She'd known Santos would betray him, but she'd also left room in her will for rehabilitation and redemption. Will you come with me? Marshall asked. Dustin smiled, the first genuine smile Marshall had seen from him in months. I was hoping you'd ask. That Saturday morning, Marshall and Dustin drove 2 hours to the federal prison where Santos was serving his sentence. Marshall had requested a private family visit, and they were led to a small room with a table and 4 chairs. When Santos walked in, Marshall barely recognized him. His son had lost 30 pounds, his expensive clothes replaced by prison khakis. But more than his appearance had changed. He moved differently, held himself differently. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked like humility. Dad, Santos said quietly, stopping a few feet away from the table. Thank you for coming. For a moment, the 3 men just looked at each other. Father, adopted son, and biological son, separated by years of pain and betrayal, but still connected by bonds that prison bars couldn't break. Then Santos did something Marshall hadn't seen him do since childhood. He began to cry. Not the angry tears of a frustrated adult, but the broken sobs of someone who'd finally understood the magnitude of his losses. I'm sorry, Santos whispered. I'm so sorry for what I did to Mom, to you, to our family. I know sorry doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I remember who I used to be. I remember the father who taught me to be honest, to work hard, to treat people with respect. I remember the mother who believed I could be anything if I just stayed true to my values. Marshall felt his own eyes filling with tears. "What happened to you, son?" Santos sat down heavily, struggling to compose himself. "I got lost. I started measuring myself by other people's standards instead of yours and Mom's. I thought success meant having more money, a bigger house, a wife who impressed people. I forgot that the most successful man I knew was the one who raised me, the man who built a business with his own hands and a marriage that lasted 37 years. They talked for 3 hours. Santos told them about his counseling sessions, his work teaching other inmates, his plans for life after prison. He spoke with genuine remorse about the pain he'd caused and with realistic understanding about how hard it would be to rebuild trust. "I don't expect forgiveness," Santos said as visiting time neared its end. "I don't expect to be welcomed back into the family like nothing happened. But I want you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to become the son Mom and Dad deserved." Marshall reached across the table and took his son's hand, something he hadn't done in 20 years. "Your mother left you $1 in her will, along with a message about finding your way back to our values. If you meant what you said today, if you keep working to become the man she knew you could be, then maybe that inheritance can grow into something more." Santos squeezed his father's hand. "I won't let you down again. See that you don't," Marshall replied. "Because this is your last chance, son. Not just with me, but with yourself." On the drive home, Dustin was unusually quiet. Finally, as they pulled into Marshall's driveway, he spoke up. "Do you think he's really changed?" Marshall looked at his house, Nancy's house, their house, and thought about second chances and the redemptive power of love. "I think," he said slowly, "that people can change if they want it badly enough. And I think your mother would want me to find out." That evening, Marshall sat in Nancy's chair and wrote his first letter to Santos. Not as a response to his son's apologies, but as a father offering guidance to a son who might finally be ready to receive it. "Dear Santos, your mother always said that the hardest thing about being a parent is knowing when to let your children fall and when to help them stand back up. I think it's time to help you stand. If you're serious about changing your life, then we'll work together to make that happen. But understand this, trust is rebuilt one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of integrity at a time. You'll have to prove yourself not just to me, but to everyone whose life you damaged. When you're released, you'll have a place to stay while you get back on your feet. Not because you're entitled to it, but because Nancy taught me that families don't abandon their members when they're struggling to find their way home. Your mother left you $1 and a message about values. Consider this letter your first installment on a larger inheritance, not of money, but of the chance to be the man she always believed you could become. Love, Dad." Marshall sealed the letter and walked outside to check Nancy's memorial garden. The roses were blooming beautifully, their white petals luminous in the moonlight. Tomorrow he would drive to the post office and mail the letter that might finally bring his son home. Nancy had been right about many things, but perhaps most importantly about this. Sometimes the people we love have to lose everything before they can find themselves. Santos had lost his freedom, his marriage, his career, and his pride. But if the letters were genuine, he might finally be finding something more valuable than any of those things, his soul. Marshall sat on the memorial bench and looked up at the stars, the same stars he and Nancy had watched from this yard for 35 years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose love over bitterness, hope over despair. Tonight, he would remember Nancy's words about trust and second chances, and he would believe that even the most broken relationships could be rebuilt if both people were willing to do the work. After all, he was Marshall McNeil, a man who'd spent his life building things that would last. And family, at its best, was built to last forever. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.